Number 9. Endurance Shipwreck. Sir Ernest Shackleton was an early 20th century explorer who apparently couldn't get enough of Antarctica. He led 3 expeditions there between 1901 and 1917. He and his crew embarked on his final Antarctic journey in 1914 aboard a 3-masted wooden ship called the Endurance. They ran into multiple problems almost immediately after leaving South Georgia Island for the Weddell Sea. The voyage was slowed down by ice, and things only worsened from there until the ship became completely trapped in an ice floe. Shackleton hoped that the vessel would eventually free itself, but he eventually realized that the pressure from the pack ice was crushing the Endurance. He ordered his crew to abandon ship, and it went down shortly thereafter. The wreckage was recently discovered on the sea floor, 4 miles from where it sank. For the past 106 years, it has sat 10,000 feet below the waves. Locating the vessel was no easy task. It took a team of experts more than 2 weeks to find it using underwater drones while combating bitter cold temperatures in some of the world's iciest waters. The ship is damaged, as the team expected, but it's in remarkable condition for its age thanks to the frigid sea, which lacks the wood-eating creatures that have destroyed wrecks elsewhere. The $10 million search and discovery were made possible thanks to an anonymous donor. Under the Antarctic Treaty, the wreckage is a protected historical monument and will therefore remain in its current resting place. Number 8. Prehistoric Polar Bear. Until somewhat recently, scientists were more or less clueless about the origins of polar bears, including when and where they first emerged and why they developed a preference for the Arctic climate. To give you an idea of how little they knew, the estimates for when the species evolved into existence range from 50,000 to more than 1 million years ago. That all changed in 2004, when a geologist unearthed the most ancient fossilized polar bear remains ever found in the form of a jawbone. He discovered the specimen while digging in the frozen tundra in Norway's Svalbard archipelago as part of a sediment research project. A DNA analysis revealed that the bear was an adult male who lived and died around 120,000 years ago. Biologist and polar bear expert Ian Sterling told Science.org that the fossil gave experts a rare glimpse into the process of one species evolving into another. The bear's DNA bore hallmarks of modern polar bears and brown bears, indicating that it was one of the first to branch off from the brown bear lineage. There are other clues that are helping to build a more complete picture of how polar bears came to exist. For example, there's a population of brown bears known as the ABC bears. They live exclusively on the Alaskan islands of Admiralty, Bannerov, and Chichagof, and they're most closely related to polar bears than other brown bears. The evidence suggests that the ancient polar bear lived at a time where the species was just starting to spread throughout the Arctic. This happened between the last 2 ice ages, when the Earth's climate was warmer than it is now. Since then, over 1,000 generations of polar bears have existed, during which time the species genetically adapted to the frigid Arctic environment that it's so well cut out for. Number 7. 24,000-year-old living organisms. In recent years, scientists have identified numerous life forms that managed to survive for tens of thousands of years in a deep freeze. One of the latest discoveries came last year, when a team of researchers discovered microscopic freshwater multicellular organisms in 24,000-year-old Siberian permafrost, known as rotifers. These creatures are found in freshwater habitats worldwide. They join a growing list of organisms that have been revived after being removed from their frozen surroundings. In 2018, the same team that recently discovered the rotifers found 40,000-year-old viable roundworms in the permafrost. Scientists have also brought ancient moss, seeds, viruses, and bacteria back to life. As fascinating as this is, it raises serious concerns about the possibility of harmful pathogens being released into the environment as glaciers and permafrost melt. In fact, experts believe that has already happened. In 2016, there was a mysterious anthrax outbreak on Siberia's Yamal Peninsula. Over 2,000 reindeer were infected and dozens of residents were hospitalized. Researchers traced the outbreak to the rotting carcass of an infected reindeer that died 80 years earlier. The animal's remains had recently been exposed during an unusual intense heat wave, which caused more of the permafrost to melt than usual. As climate change accelerates melting, viruses and bacteria will continue to become active after lengthy dormant periods. And there's unfortunately a good chance that there will be more outbreaks of anthrax and other diseases. Number 6. A new Arctic island. During a research expedition in the Arctic last year, A group of scientists arrived at what they initially believed was Udok, an island that was discovered not that long ago in 1978. But they soon realized that they were further north than they originally thought, and that they had discovered a new island that nobody knew about. Expedition leader Morten Roche said that when he posted photos of the island's coordinates on social media, many self-proclaimed island hunters were in disbelief. Until now, Udok was officially considered the world's northernmost island. The newly discovered island sits about 2,600 feet north of Udok. It was revealed by shifting pack ice that had previously concealed it. Ice or no ice, it's easy to understand why nobody even noticed this tiny piece of land, which measures just 100 by 200 feet. It consists mainly of small mounds of silt and gravel, and appears to be largely devoid of life. Researchers don't expect it to exist for very long. Just one bad storm could potentially wipe it off the map, according to Roche. The team doesn't think that climate change is responsible for revealing the island, which comes as good news in a world where the effects of global warming are becoming more and more noticeable. They propose naming it Kikartik, which is Greenlandic, for the northernmost island. Do you think there's more islands that haven't been discovered yet? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. Number 5. Kuka Shipwreck. Built in 1889, the Kuka was a 172-foot-long wooden tow barge that spent most of its time carrying lumber across the Great Lakes. During the Prohibition era, it became a party boat headquartered in northern Michigan's Lake Charlevoix. According to local legend, Al Capone frequented these gatherings, as he may have even owned the boat. By then, the aging vessel was falling into despair and needed to be pumped out daily. But this didn't stop partygoers from cruising along the lake, which afforded the kind of privacy that they needed to avoid getting caught drinking by the police. It wasn't all fun and games though, and residents grew tired of the violence and debauchery that went on board the Kuka. The final straw came in 1931 when a manager tried to break up a fight and was shot. What happened after that isn't exactly clear. According to Up North Live, a local church bought the floating vice den. It sank the following year under suspicious conditions. Some speculate the church members sabotaged the Kuka, perhaps to make sure it could never be used for parties again, or to avoid a tax liability. Even though the boat was old and in rough shape, there were no outward signs that it was going to sink. But it is possible that it simply wasn't seaworthy. Divers Chris Roxburgh and Dusty Cliffman recently cut through a thick layer of ice to explore the wreck, which sits 50 feet below the surface. They found it in surprisingly good condition, owing to the lake's relatively calm waters. But the investigation didn't bring the pair any closer to knowing exactly what sent the Kuka to its watery grave. Number 4. High-altitude Viking sword. In 2017, reindeer hunters spotted a seemingly man-made artifact resting between two boulders in Norway's Upland region, roughly 5,380 feet above sea level. It was an 1,100-year-old Viking sword, and this was the highest elevation that an object of this type has ever been found. The weapon's finders alerted archaeologists, who investigated the site in hopes of finding more artifacts and perhaps even a Viking burial. But they came up empty-handed, which begged the obvious question of how the sword alone ended up there. It's possible that an ancient hunter dropped it while walking through the woods, and the person may have even died nearby, even though their remains haven't been found. For now, experts can only speculate about the sword's origin. Tests revealed traces of lichen, indicating that there were periods where it was exposed to the environment, despite having spent a considerable amount of time buried in snow and ice. But based on the amount of time it spent out there in the open during the region's short summers of a 1,000-year period, the sword should have held more lichen on it when it was found, and it also should have been rustier than it was. The weapon is in excellent condition. In fact, it would still be functional today if it were fitted with a new handle. According to scientists at the University of Ulso, they believe that its remarkably intact state may result from being in a somewhat dry location, as well as the lack of corrosive salt in the high-altitude environment. Number 3. A new Antarctic island. The Antarctic Peninsula's two major glaciers are retreating at an unprecedented speed. As the ice melts, previously hidden parts of our planet that no modern human have ever seen are being revealed. 2 years ago, scientists with the International Thwaites Glacier Offshore Research Project discovered an uncharted island that was visible above sea level for the first time in human history. They spotted the 1,150-foot landmass while sailing near the Pine Island Glacier. The team visited the island specifically to examine the layer of brown rock that helped them identify it as actual land in the first place. They determined that it was made from volcanic granite. It's the only rocky outcropping of its kind for at least 40 miles in any direction. according to expedition member James Marshallek. The team named the landmass Sif Island, after the Norse goddess representing the Earth. Most of the island is completely covered in ice. Based on satellite images, researchers believe that it was once part of the dwindling Pine Island Glacier ice shelf. A time-lapse analysis shows that the ice shelf began to steadily retreat from the island in 2011. The island may have appeared during a process called rebounding, when melting glacial ice relieves underlying pressure, causing land to rise above sea level. Number 2. Prehistoric Lake. There's been times throughout the world's history, namely during periods of global warming hundreds of thousands or even millions of years ago, when Greenland was ice-free. At one point, a 2,700 square mile lake formed. It was roughly the size of Rhode Island and Delaware combined and was over 800 feet deep at its deepest point. At least 18 streams fed into the lake from the north, and it drained through an outlet to the south. Over the last million years or so, the ice that covered most of Greenland has advanced and retreated. Today, the lake sits over a mile below the existing ice sheet. All that's left is its sediment, and scientists don't know when it last held water. They discovered the Paleo Lake Basin using surface-penetrating radar, which enables researchers to identify objects and sites that are hidden or difficult to spot. So far, experts only know rudimentary details about the lake, and they don't fully know how it was formed. Theory suggests that a glacier carved the body of water out of the landscape, or that perhaps a depression formed when an ancient, now deformed fault line pulled part of the Earth's crust apart. Until or unless the ice covering the lake melts, the only way to determine its age or learn anything else about it is to drill into it. Researchers believe that the buried sediment may contain telling evidence of the site's climatic history, as well as any life that existed there in the past. This information can prove especially valuable for guiding Greenland's response to climate change. Numerous subglacial lakes have been discovered in Greenland and Antarctica in recent years, but this is the first example of a fossil lake bed beneath the ice. Over the next several years, scientists plan to drill into northwestern Greenland's bedrock in hopes of learning more about its geological and environmental past. And number 1. Subglacial Lakes. There's a vast network of subglacial lakes hidden beneath the Antarctic ice, buried anywhere from 1.2 to 2.5 miles below the surface. These little-studied bodies of water experience a strange filling and draining cycle that scientists don't fully understand, and they believe that this actively may affect the movement of ice sheets, including how fast they travel, as well as how and where meltwater reaches the ocean. This, in turn, can influence the Southern Ocean's currents, which could possibly have a global impact on ocean circulation. In other words, while it's easy to feel unaffected by something that goes on so far away, the effects are far-reaching and perhaps worldwide. Last July, scientists announced the discovery of 2 new lakes, dubbed the Lower Conway Subglacial Lake and the Lower Mercer Subglacial Lake. They sit on the continent's rocky surface, where the glacier meets the land. They were identified as part of a study, which also found that many of Antarctica's subglacial lakes have drained and refilled numerous times over the last 17 years. Researchers determined that there are connections between these bizarre cycles of ice sheet movement, but they're still trying to figure out the exact nature of these relationships. Learning more about these cycles will lead to a better understanding of climate change and the things that can be done to slow it down.
Number 9. Kilden. Kilden is a small Russian island located in the Barents Sea, roughly 75 miles off the Norwegian coast. It's filled with old, rotting military equipment, including planes and construction vehicles, as well as a deposit of expended reactors from Soviet nuclear submarines. The Russian presence on the island goes back to 1957, when an underground missile complex was built there. It was designed to aim at enemy vessels that came too close to Kilden for comfort. By World War II, the island's facilities had grown to include many underground tunnels, commander facilities, and storage spaces. During the Soviet era, there were 4 vessels that operated between the island and the mainland. Today, there's no human activity on Kilden. The military left in 1995, just a few years after the Soviet Union collapsed. Just one vessel even goes near the island, and it doesn't stop there. It just passes by while traveling its route between Murmansk and Ostrovnoye. But the decaying military equipment remains there, eerie and abandoned. The waters off Kilden have seen plenty of activity even after its closure. In 1992, 3 years before the military left, the American submarine USS Baton Rouge collided with the Russian vessel K-276 Kostroma. 11 years later, in 2003, the Russian submarine K-159 sank off Kilden during a storm while on the way to a scrapyard. 9 members of the 10-person crew tragically perished in the accident. Number 8. Clipperton. Clipperton Island is a tiny, isolated atoll in the eastern Pacific, located just west of Mexico. While no one lives there now, it was inhabited for a short time during the early 20th century. It's hard to understand how this barren landmass, with no freshwater source, appealed to anyone. But it was once abundant with guano, or bat droppings, a highly profitable raw material used in fertilizer. Eager to cash in on the valuable manure, the British Pacific Mining Company built a mining operation on Clipperton with permission from the Mexican government. Around 100 men and women moved there for work. Their necessities came every 2 months by ship. These infrequent but once reliable shipments stopped during the Mexican Revolution. People who lived on Clipperton were simply forgotten about as they languished without food, medication, and other life-sustaining supplies. At one point, a passing American ship offered to help. Confident that Mexico would come to their aid, the island's overseer, Captain Raymond Arno, stubbornly refused any assistance. By 1915, malnutrition and scurvy had killed most of Clipperton's residents. One day, Arno and 3 other men tried catching the attention of a distant ship, but their canoe capsized and they drowned. 2 years later, only 1 man and 15 women remained. The sole surviving man went on a rape and murder campaign and declared himself the king of Clipperton, but his reign was short-lived. Arno's wife and another woman killed him. Hours later, a U.S. Navy vessel rescued the remaining handful of survivors. The settlement's ruins are still on the island, which receives no visitors due to its remoteness. Number 7. Fort Carroll. Located in Maryland's Patapsco River near the Francis Scott Key Bridge, Fort Carroll is the name of both a 3.5-acre man-made island and the abandoned hexagonal fort that sits on it. Built in 1848 to protect the city of Baltimore from naval attacks, it was commissioned by Robert E. Lee, who went on to command the Confederate Army during the American Civil War. Fort Carroll never saw combat, and by World War I, the structure and its weaponry were outdated. The property was disarmed and abandoned in 1921. It was briefly used as a firing range during the Second World War. In 1958, a Baltimore-based lawyer named Benjamin Eisenberg bought the island with plans to build a casino, a hotel, and some restaurants on it. But the judge ruled that the fort is in a county where slots are illegal, and Eisenberg ended up doing absolutely nothing with the property. The Eisenberg family still owned Fort Carroll as of late 2019. It's become decrepit and overgrown and has no purpose other than functioning as a de facto bird sanctuary. The crumbling and cracked concrete structure is home to hundreds of seagulls, herons, and members of other avian species. Urban explorers are typically the only humans to visit the island. The property was added to the National Register of Historic Places in 2015 at the urging of the Maryland Historical Trust and with support from the Eisenbergs. It was valued at $31,500, and any potential buyers must be willing to restore the fort. Would you be interested in buying your own island, bird sanctuary, and historical fixer-upper at that price? Share in the comments. Number 6. Navassa. Most people have never heard of Navassa, arguably the strangest Caribbean island. It's barely bigger than Central Park in New York City. It's located between Haiti and Cuba and belongs to the United States. Navassa's first known visitors were some crewmen who were sent there by Columbus in 1504. They drank contaminated water and died shortly after arriving. In 1857, an American sea captain claimed the island as a U.S. territory. For the next 30 years, it was mined for its extensive deposits of guano, or bird droppings, which was used for making gunpowder and fertilizer. In 1889, after mining over 1 million tons of guano by hand, the African-American workers at Navassa rebelled and killed 5 of their supervisors. Ownership of the island thereafter became a contentious, ongoing debate that eventually went all the way to the US Supreme Court. Navassa was abandoned in 1898 after the Spanish-American War. Today, it's filled mostly with feral dogs, lizards, and the occasional team of researchers. The island's ownership is still being disputed. Haiti claims Navassa in its constitution, and the US designated it as a national wildlife refuge in 1999. In 2012, scientists discovered a rich coral ecosystem in the reefs surrounding the island. It consists of numerous endangered coral species. Regardless of which country owns Navassa, it's arguably a good thing that people rarely go there, and that its environment is protected from human activity. Number 5. Hashima. Hashima is a 16-acre island located off the coast of Nagasaki, Japan. It was once home to a coal mining facility and a surrounding settlement that grew rapidly as workers and their families moved in. People, buildings, and pathways were literally stacked on top of each other at Hashima. Concrete tower blocks were connected by a series of overhead bridges, as well as a maze of streets and underground tunnels. Shops, schools, public pools, and other buildings sprang up to accommodate Hashima's rapidly growing population. The metropolis eventually became so jam-packed that the island had to be expanded with landfill. At its peak, Hashima was home to 5,259 residents and had a population density of 216,264 people per square mile, or 2.5 square kilometers. To give you an idea of just how crowded it was, modern-day Manhattan has a population density of 66,940 people per square mile, or 2.5 square kilometers. As many as 6 people were crammed into each tiny apartment. The demand for coal eventually fell and the industry began to lag, leading to Hashima's closure in 1974. After nearly a century of use, the island was abandoned. Many families left their belongings behind, and the structures they once occupied and used were also simply left as is. What's left of the once bustling city now sits eerily silent and crumbling from decades of neglect. The ruins at Hashima are dangerous. Visitors can catch a glimpse from a distance during guided tours, but exploring the ruins up close requires special permission from local authorities. Would you think it's worthwhile to seek the special permission needed to explore these dense abandoned ruins? Share in the comments and make sure to like and subscribe to the channel as well. Number 4. Troman Island. Located roughly 280 miles east of Madagascar in the Indian Ocean, the very small island of Troman is part of the Scattered Islands. Also known as the Îles Éparses, the French-owned archipelago was discovered in 1722. It was mostly left alone until 1761, when the French slave ship L'Utile wrecked at Troman's northern reef. There were initially hundreds of survivors who worked together to dig a well and build a shelter. A white crew left on a boat made from the salvaged remains of L'Utile, promising to return for the 60 surviving slaves they left on the island. But no one returned until 15 years later when the French ship La Dauphine arrived in 1776. Miraculously, 7 of the original survivors, all women, were still alive, along with an 8-month-old infant. They had survived by digging small shelters on the flat island and fortifying them with rocks. The group stayed fed by eating crabs and turtles that came there to nest. Nobody visited Troman Island again until 1856. The French established a weather station there in 1954. Despite the limited number of people there at any given time, the island still suffered from human activity. By the time the weather station was implemented, just 2 of the 8 different bird species that once bred there remained. The island also became overrun by invasive rodents, including mice and Norway rats. The Norway rats were successfully eradicated in 2005. Since then, much of Troman Island's vegetation and wildlife has recovered. Several seabirds have returned, including the brown-footed booby. Today, the island's human presence is restricted to scientific researchers, and its ecosystem continues to thrive. The remains of the castaways' shelters are still there as an eerie reminder of how 60 resilient souls were once left to die, but managed to make do with the few materials that were available to them. Number 3. Ross Island. During the British imperial rule over India in the 19th century, royal colonial authorities established a penal colony in the remote Andaman and Nicobar Islands in the Indian Ocean. Located over 800 miles from the Indian mainland, the far-flung region seemed like the perfect place for imprisoning rebels who fought back against British rule. Officials chose a tiny landmass measuring less than 1/3 of a square mile, known as Ross Island, as the penal colony's administrative headquarters. They forced inmates to clear trees to make rooms for dozens of upscale Victorian-style buildings, including an extravagant bungalow for the penitentiary's commissioner. Ross Island also had tennis courts, swimming pools, a church, and elegant gardens, ensuring that top-ranking prison staff had to make minimal sacrifices when it came to the luxurious lifestyle they were accustomed to. Meanwhile, convicts languished in deplorable conditions. They were malnourished, overworked, exposed to disease, and experimented on with malaria drugs that made them extremely sick and depressed. For decades, human rights abuses were committed against prisoners simply for daring to fight for their country's freedom. The site finally closed in 1937. Just a handful of years later, during World War II, the Japanese raided Ross Island in search of useful materials. Soon enough, the Allies recaptured it. Today, the Indian government oversees the eerie crumbling ruins, which have been reclaimed by nature. Number 2. Año Nuevo Island. Located off the California coast between San Francisco and Santa Cruz, Año Nuevo is a 9-acre island with a lighthouse that helped ships navigate from 1872 to 1948. At first, a foghorn was installed following several shipwrecks near the shoreline. After that, a light, keeper's quarters, dock, boathouse, and other support facilities were built. It was a challenge to maintain the structures due to damage from the salty sea air, and wild seals invaded the buildings despite fences being built to prevent them from getting in. In 1948, the Coast Guard deemed the facilities at Año Nuevo Island too expensive to maintain and ordered its closure. The system that was once operated by a staff was replaced by a marker buoy with automatic sound, light, and radar. In 1955, the federal government sold the island to the state of California. In an effort to protect breeding seal colonies, authorities classified it as a scientific preserve and banned visitors. The buildings on Año Nuevo Island deteriorated from prolonged exposure to the elements and a lack of upkeep. They were also damaged and burned by trespassers. Elephant seals, sea lions, and birds took over the keeper's quarters, furthering the decay. Today, the island remains closed to the public and is overrun by thousands of marine animals. Its only human visitors are researchers. Some of the abandoned structures still stand, but they're in extremely poor shape. Number 1. Discovery Island. In Bay Lake, Florida, there's an 11.5-acre island that was once home to Disney's Discovery Island, where visitors went to see rare birds and other exotic wildlife starting in 1974. The park closed in 1999 after operating for 25 years. While the reasons for shuttering its doors remain somewhat of a mystery, poor attendance and high maintenance costs were likely factors in the decision. Discovery Island's animals were relocated to Disney's Animal Kingdom. The former park has sat abandoned ever since. It mostly draws curious urban explorers like Shane Perez, a blogger who swam through alligator-infested waters with his friends to reach Discovery Island in 2009, more than a decade after it closed. When they first arrived on the island, it sounded as if they were surrounded by thousands of birds, Perez later recalled. They encountered several angry vultures before discovering that the electrics still worked inside the park's haunting remnants, which had become overgrown with plant wildlife. The group also found old Polaroid photos of employees scattered throughout the buildings, as well as preserved snakes inside jars and plenty of garbage, including an empty Coca-Cola bottle. Not all of Discovery Island's unwelcome visitors found it as creepy as Perez and his pals did. When authorities discovered a homeless man camping there in 2020 and ordered him to leave, he described the park as a tropical paradise and said that he didn't know he wasn't allowed to be there.
Number 9. Oscar II class submarines. The Oscar-class submarines are a series of nuclear-powered cruise missile subs that were developed as part of what the Soviets called Project 949, which began during the 1970s. They were the world's largest operating cruise missile subs until 2007, when the U.S. Navy modernized some of its Ohio-class ballistic missile submarines. The only other larger classes of submarines that exist are the Soviet Typhoon-class and Russian Borei-class vessels. Oscar-class subs were designed to attack NATO naval fleets. Even when the Soviet Union faced mounting financial problems and its impending downfall, the Oscar-class vessels remained a priority, serving in both the Northern and Pacific fleets as older submarines were decommissioned. A program to modernize the subs, known as Project 949 AM, started in 2011 with plans to update at least 3 Oscar-class vessels. For a cost of around $182 million per vehicle, the trio of submarines would undergo maintenance and repairs to extend their life by at least 20 years. In addition to upgrading their technology, the Russian Navy planned to replace outdated missiles with new and improved weapons. A submarine called the Irkutsk is the first to undergo the modernization scheme. Commissioned in 1988, the 30-plus-year-old vessel will be equipped with the latest missile, torpedo, and communication systems, including a complex new system that will enable it to launch hypersonic missiles. If everything goes according to schedule, the Irkutsk will return to naval service sometime this year. The project appears to be going smoothly and has been expanded to include as many as 7 submarines, which means they could present a major threat if things continue to escalate. Number 8. Spy Satellite. Satellite technology has been a game changer when it comes to modern warfare and international relations. Countries that can afford to do so are increasingly turning to spy satellites to keep an eye on their adversaries. The abilities that come along with these advanced devices would have been unfathomable to the world's militaries just a century ago, when wars were fought up close and personal. In 2020, news headlines reported that a pair of strange Russian spacecrafts were trailing an American military satellite hundreds of miles above the Earth. After entering orbit just a few months before making news headlines, the Russian spacecraft began maneuvering toward the American satellite, ultimately coming within an unfathomably close distance of less than 100 miles. To many, this represented a growing competition between the U.S. and Russia for superiority in the space-based espionage department. U.S. Space Force Commander General John Ray Raymond described the movement as unusual and disturbing, with the potential to create a dangerous situation in space. The U.S. government reportedly expressed its concern to Moscow, but diplomats seemed unwilling to discuss the matter. The chances of the two countries having a civilized meeting of any sort is even more unlikely now, as Putin blatantly refuses to scale back his invasion of Ukraine, showing that he truly doesn't care how other countries feel about his decisions. Number 7. 3M-22 Zircon Hypersonic Missile. A hypersonic weapon travels at a speed of at least Mach 5, or 5 times the speed of sound. The United States has experimented with this technology in recent years, and Russia claims to be doing the same. Not long after the U.S. completed its first successful test flight of an experimental hypersonic aircraft in 2013, Russian officials announced that they were further along in the process of developing these types of weapons. Known as the 3M-22 Zircon hypersonic missile, the Russian-built vehicle flew at speeds similar to the Wave Rider, peaking at nearly 4,000 miles per hour. It runs on advanced fuel, giving it a 621-mile range. The Zircon flies fast enough to evade traditional radar systems, which means that it could potentially strike a target with little to no warning. To put it in perspective, a U.S. ship would have just a minute to respond if it detected a Zircon missile heading in its direction from 100 miles away. Intercepting the weapon would be incredibly difficult. This is especially concerning since it would only take a few Zircon missiles to sink even the most advanced American aircraft carrier. If Russia's claims about its hypersonic capabilities are true, it means that the U.S. needs to not only catch up, but take their technological advancements to the next level soon. Number 6. Massive nuclear submarines. Typhoon-class submarines, also known under the designated Soviet name Project 941 Akula, were designed and built for the Soviet Navy. All 6 of these nuclear-powered ballistic missile submarines were built during the 1970s and 80s. Measuring nearly 575 feet long, the Typhoons are the largest submarines ever built. Each vehicle had enough room to accommodate a crew of over 160 for months at a time. Only one of these vessels, the Dmitry Donskoy, remains in service today. It was the first Typhoon-class submarine to be built. Today, it functions as a missile testing platform. 2 other Typhoon subs, the Arkhangelsk and the Severstal, remain on reserve in case they're ever needed, but are not actively serving. But since 2010, most of the Typhoons have been replaced by the newer Borei-class submarines. At 557 feet long, these more modern vessels are nearly as long as their predecessors. Design work on the Borei class started in the 1980s, and construction on the first vessel began in 1996. The submarines first entered service in 2013. They represent some of the Russian Navy's most advanced technology and are enabling the military to patrol southern latitudes that have not seen a Russian missile submarine in 2 decades. The Cold War ended during the 90s, but the continued development of nuclear submarine technology proves that the competition between the US and Russia for military superiority remains strong. The new Bore-class subs are part of Russia's nuclear deterrent force, which was recently put on high alert amid the country's invasion into Ukraine. They're joined by 4 newly developed Khabarovsk-class submarines. Each Khabarovsk sub is equipped with 6 nuclear-powered drone torpedoes that are capable of traveling across oceans and hitting coastal cities and military bases. The bombs are powerful enough to do 10 times more damage than the nuclear weapons that the US dropped on Japan during World War II. As tensions escalate between Putin's government and the growing number of countries who disagree with his recent actions, the nuclear deterrent force is ready to respond on a moment's notice to any perceived aggression from NATO forces. Number 5. RS28 Sarmat. Since 2009, the Russian military has been working to design a super heavy intercontinental ballistic missile, or ICBM, called the RS28 Sarmat. Known under the NATO reporting names SSX-29 and SSX-30, the liquid-fueled weapon contains several warheads that are capable of being programmed to hit different targets. It's being developed as a replacement for the outdated R-36 ICBM, which first entered service during the 1960s. The Sarmat is one of 6 strategic weapons that Vladimir Putin unveiled in 2018 as part of his vision to keep up with the advancing technology of other militaries and the potential threats that they pose. With a range of 11,000 miles, its capabilities are far-reaching. The missile can fly over the North and South Poles and along other unconventional routes, bypassing missile defense areas and approaching its targets unpredictably. Naturally, a weapon of this magnitude is a major cause for concern among countries that have tense relations with Russia, including the US. Some even speculate that the Sarmat is powerful enough to wipe out an area of land the size of England or Wales. Putin was happy to feed into these fears, claiming last year that even the most advanced anti-ballistic missile defenses could not stand up to the Sarmat. The project is years behind schedule but is nonetheless ongoing, leaving a big question mark on how the US will flex its nuclear superiority in response to the final product. Do you think the production of this particular intercontinental ballistic missile should be a major concern for the US and its NATO allies? Share your views in the comments and make sure to subscribe for all the latest videos. Number 4. AM Autonomous Strike Drone. The Russian military marked a major milestone in 2019 when the country's Ministry of Defense announced the successful flight of its first unmanned aerial combat vehicle. Known as the Sukhoi S-70 Okhotnik B and nicknamed the Hunter, the vehicle is an autonomous drone that was designed to drop precision-guided bombs at long ranges without a pilot. It looks somewhat like the American-made B-2 stealth bomber. The Hunter was first spotted in Siberia 3 years ago during ground trials at the Shukhalov aviation plant outside the city of Novosibirsk. After visiting the facility in late 2019, Vladimir Putin announced that the aircraft's development was moving along according to schedule. With no need for a cockpit or equipment for performing life-saving functions on pilots, the Okhotnik has more room for weapons. It was built with technology that has been around for a while and has been used by many Western countries, including the US. But the drone marks a milestone in the advancement of Russian military technology and the country's readiness when it comes to attacking heavily defended targets. The second Okhotnik prototype made its debut late last year. Preparations for its first flight are currently underway, according to state-sponsored news agency TASS. Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu said that the development of the Okhotnik will hopefully be finished by the end of the year. Troops are expected to start receiving deliveries of the drone in 2024. Number 3. Night vision technology. The Russian military's most sophisticated night vision goggles first went on display in 2019 at an exhibition of artifacts from the country's operations in Syria. Known under the type name GEO-ONV-1, the helmet-mounted goggles reportedly outshine U.S. night vision technology when it comes to their operational capabilities. They were designed for attack and military transport helicopter crews after a Russian helicopter crashed in Syria in 2016, killing both pilots. The pair had been operating the aircraft using a previous version of the eyewear that was developed during the 1990s. After the accident, military helicopter crews were immediately banned from using the old goggles and were issued the newer ones. Having the right night vision technology can not only mean the difference between life and death, it makes pilots more effective during nighttime combat by enabling them to fly accurately, navigate complex terrain, and perform complicated takeoffs and landings. Knowing that Russia is on par with or possibly ahead of the US when it comes to advanced night vision is definitely a cause for concern over which country has an upper hand with military operations in the pitch dark. Number 2. Sukhoi Su57. Russia has been working steadfastly since 2002 to develop a stealth fighter jet called the Sukhoi Su57. Designed under the Air Force-sponsored PAC-FA fighter program, the single-seat aircraft aims to be the best of the best at carrying out air attack operations. The Su-57 is equipped with numerous sophisticated features, including super maneuverability, super cruise, and advanced avionics that supersede the previous generation of fighter aircraft. It's the most advanced Russian fighter jet in existence and is one of only 4 operational 5th-generation stealth fighter jets in the world. Late last year, state news agency TASS claimed that the Su-57 had outperformed its American equivalents, the F-22 and F-35, during test flights. Military expert Alexei Leonkov said that the Su-57 is superior when it comes to weapon systems, robotics, radar, and electronic warfare equipment. Western media balked at these claims, arguing that American-made 5th-generation fighter jets are better than the Su-57. Moscow plans to start producing an upgraded version of the aircraft in 2025, complete with a 2-seat modification that allows a second pilot to control nearby combat drones. It's capable of flying at speeds of up to Mach 2 or 2 times the speed of sound. At just $25 million to $30 million each, the new and improved Su-57 will come at a much cheaper price tag than its American counterparts. It's hard to say whether US or Russian-made fighter jets reign supreme, since the debate is limited to one country's word against the other. But it's clear that Russia has caught up with American fighter jet technology, and there are no signs of any plans to slow down on the development of faster, stealthier, and more advanced military planes. Number 1. Nuclear weapons. Russia is one of the world's 2 biggest nuclear powers, with the other being the United States. These 2 countries possess the largest amount of the deadliest weapons ever built. During the Cold War arms race, the US and the Soviet Union amassed around 64,000 nuclear warheads. That number has since reduced dramatically thanks to an agreement among numerous nations known as the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which aims to keep the worldwide nuclear weapon count at 10,000 or fewer. Even with this policy in place, Russia has enough nukes to wipe out an entire enemy state. Thankfully, most experts think nuclear warfare is unlikely. The catastrophic bombs have only been used twice in war, when the US bombed the Japanese cities of Nagasaki and Hiroshima at the end of World War II. The simple truth is that nobody would benefit from a nuclear attack. For example, if Russia bombed the US, the American military would undoubtedly retaliate to an equal or greater degree. This concept, known as mutually assured destruction, is the number 1 factor that has kept either of these superpowers from taking the ultimate in drastic actions, hitting the nuke button. Even in the event of a nuclear war, it's possible that any countries involved in a conflict between the US and Russia, including both countries' allies, would follow suit and resort to using their most destructive weapons. It's likely that the world's other 3 nuclear powers, which include China, France, and the UK, would take sides in a situation like this, thereby increasing the likelihood for things to get ugly on a devastating level. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up and don't forget to subscribe in order to get all the latest and most fascinating content you need to know about. Thanks again, and we'll see you next time for another amazing video right here on American Eye.